It started with a cry, thin, sharp, and unnatural, rising above the hum of rain hitting the asphalt. On an empty backroad at the edge of nowhere, a wounded black stray dog stopped mid-step, ears twitching, body trembling. She shouldn't have turned back. She was starving, limping, barely alive. But something in that broken sound pulled her off the path. Beneath the thorn brush, soaked and shivering, was a creature no dog should have gone near, a leopard cub, eyes barely open, breath shallow. No mother in sight. No safety. Just teeth, instinct, and a choice. What happened next would defy everything we thought we knew about predators. And mothers, if you've made it this far and still haven't hit subscribe, maybe this is your sign. Stories like these aren't just watched, they're felt. Don't miss the next one. Tap subscribe now. The storm had begun before sunset, and by nightfall, the forest was drowning. Torrents of wind slashed through pine boughs, and lightning ripped the sky in jagged silence before thunder shattered it moments later. Mud slithered down the hillsides like snakes, and the creek that usually whispered beside the southern trail now roared with muddy defiance, dragging branches, leaves, and something else. Beneath that deafening rain, few would have heard the whimper. But she did. Her name was Callie, a 6-year-old golden retriever with fur the color of sunlit wheat and eyes so human in their softness that the townsfolk often joked she'd once been a woman in another life. Callie lived on the edge of the Rowan Pines Wildlife Reserve, in a cabin with the only human she had ever fully trusted, Eleanor Dwyer, a 55-year-old wildlife caretaker who had left her career in veterinary medicine after her husband's death, retreating to the solitude of the reserve with nothing but boxes of wildlife reports, a pair of worn hiking boots, and Callie. It was Callie who barked first that night, low and urgent, pawing at the door until Eleanor opened it with a sigh. "You're not going out in this," she murmured, rain blowing against her face. But Callie bolted. She ran through the soaked underbrush, her paws sinking into the churned soil, until she stopped near a fallen tree. Something was there. Barely a shape beneath the slanted wall of water, something trembling and slick with mud. At first glance, Eleanor, who had followed with a flashlight and heart pounding, thought it was a baby deer. Then she saw the spots. A leopard cub? It was unthinkable. There hadn't been a leopard sighting in this part of Georgia in decades. The reserve mostly held bobcats, foxes, and the occasional black bear. And yet here was a cub, maybe 5 weeks old, soaked to the bone, gasping, eyes fluttering. There were no signs of a mother. No tracks. No blood. Just this abandoned scrap of spotted fur and fragile ribs. Eleanor's instincts kicked in. She wrapped the cub in her rain jacket and raced back through the trees, Callie close behind. The cabin was quickly turned into a makeshift ER. Warm towels, heated blankets, the hum of Eleanor's old portable incubator. She'd seen critical cases before, but this one was worse. The cub's body temperature was dropping dangerously, and his breathing was labored. Eleanor named him Ash, for the pale gray hue of his soaked fur. But what happened next was not part of any medical protocol. Callie, instead of retreating to her usual corner, curled around the incubator like a mother wolf. She barely slept. She nosed at the glass, whined when Ash whimpered, and licked his paw gently through the holes. When Eleanor moved the cub to a warm blanket by the fire 2 days later, Callie lay beside him. When the bottle feeding started, Callie waited each time, nudging Eleanor when Ash didn't respond fast enough. And when Ash cried through the night, it was Callie, not Eleanor, who calmed him. Weeks passed. Ash grew stronger. His eyes cleared from milky blue to amber gold. He started swatting at Callie's tail, then nipping at her ears, then tackling her gently in play. Eleanor captured hours of footage on her old camcorder, unsure whether the world would ever believe what was happening, a domestic dog raising a wild leopard cub like her own. But it wasn't just play. There was protection in every gesture. When Eleanor introduced a large stuffed toy leopard for stimulation, Ash shredded it with a furious growl, until Callie barked once, sharply. Ash backed off, ears flat. That same afternoon, Eleanor watched as Callie licked the torn toy gently, then nudged it back toward Ash, who sniffed it and lay beside it like it were a sibling. The message was clear. Callie was teaching him empathy. It was unspoken, but powerful. By 4 months, Ash was growing too fast. His spotted coat had turned a rich gold, and his body lengthened into lean muscle. His claws once. "Callie, find him!" Callie barked, ears up, racing down the gravel path into the woods. Eleanor grabbed the tranquilizer kit, heart pounding, breath ragged. Every scenario raced through her mind. He could get hit by a car. He could wander into town. He could be killed on sight by a frightened hunter. But above all, he could vanish forever. But Callie had never failed to find what she loved. It took hours, but by dusk, Eleanor heard the bark. Callie was sitting at the edge of a clearing, unmoving. Across from her, Ash stood still, his eyes wide, muscles coiled. "Easy, Ash," Eleanor whispered, lifting the tranquilizer rifle. But she didn't need it. Soft and hesitant, now scraped the hardwood floor. Callie didn't flinch. She played with him still, allowed him to leap onto her, tolerated his bursts of energy. She barked when his play grew too rough, correcting him with firm maternal growls. And he listened. Eleanor knew the bond was real. But it couldn't last. Ash was a wild predator. Eventually, instinct would outweigh nurture. He needed to be relocated, and soon. But the thought of separating him from Callie, it broke something in Eleanor she didn't know she still had. Then came the day when Ash found the open door. Eleanor had stepped out to get the mail. Callie was asleep. And Ash, by now 10 months old and nearly full-sized, had been pacing restlessly all morning. By the time Eleanor returned, he was gone. She dropped the letters. Callie walked toward him slowly, tail wagging, and nuzzled his cheek. And Ash, predator, orphan, wild thing, lowered his head and pressed it into her chest. He had come back. That night, Eleanor sat by the fire, tears in her eyes as she watched them curled up together, the leopard-spotted flank rising and falling beside the golden fur of the dog who had raised him. But she knew time was running out. Ash was ready. He had to be introduced to a monitored wilderness, far from the cabin, far from Callie. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. The Couldnt Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat on the edge of a vast golden plain that stretched beyond the eye's reach. From the porch of her small, weathered cabin, 38-year-old veterinarian Eleanor, Ellie, Marlowe often watched the sun disappear behind the acacia trees. She had come to the savannah a decade ago, driven by a personal loss that still echoed in her quiet moments. A brother who had devoted his life to wildlife and died protecting it. In Couldnt, she found a different kind of purpose, mending what had been broken, whether bones, hearts, or bonds. 3 years had passed since Ellie had witnessed something so improbable, it bordered on myth. A mother dog, a sandy-colored mutt named Calla, who had wandered into the center bleeding and feral, had taken in an orphaned leopard cub. No one expected her to nurse the creature, let alone love him. But she had. And not as a caretaker, not as a surrogate, but as a mother. Ellie had named the cub Kyr, meaning dark one, in Old Celtic. With mottled fur and wide green eyes, Kyr had grown fast, strong, wild, beautiful. But wild things do not stay. At 1.5 years old, Kyr had been released into a protected section of the grasslands, monitored but free. Ellie hadn't known how to explain it to Calla, who paced the edge of the fencing for days, tail low, nose pressed into the dirt where Kyr's scent once lingered. The heartbreak was not just hers. It had been 6 months since Kyr's release, and Ellie now busied herself with new rescues, a wounded serval caught in wire, a troop of dehydrated vervet monkeys, and a baby giraffe barely clinging to life. But late at night, when the wind whispered through the tall elephant grass, she thought of Kyr. Of the bond between predator and protector, and whether he still remembered. Then came the night of the fire. A lightning storm rolled in from the northeast, electric veins ripping the sky above the forested belt that bordered the reserve. Ellie had just closed the last animal shelter door when the first flickers of flame erupted beyond the trees. The wind was wrong, southward. Fast. Too fast. "Get the tranquilizers! Load the carriers!" She yelled into her walkie as smoke began pouring in over the hills. The staff, 8 volunteers from Europe and 2 Mossite trackers, scrambled into motion. Calla had vanished. Panic pulsed through Ellie's chest. In her gut, she knew where the dog had gone, toward Keir. Toward fire. Hours later, ash rained over the savannah like snow. The forest belt was lost, devoured in a roaring fury that climbed trees and swallowed nests whole. Ellie, her hands blistered from heat, stood at the edge of the blackened woods, flashlight in hand, calling into the smoke. Calla! Keir! Only silence answered. But then, rustling. 2 green eyes shimmered from the underbrush, faint against the haze. Then emerged a form, sleek, charred at the edges, limping. Keir! Behind him, Calla stumbled forward, her coat singed, her nose pressed against his flank as if guiding him. The young leopard collapsed at Ellie's feet, chest heaving. But it wasn't just fire that had nearly killed him. Embedded in his side was a steel snare hook. He'd been caught. Ellie dropped to her knees, whispering his name over and over like a prayer. Her eyes welled, but she kept her hands steady, examining the wound. Infection had set in. He was dying. They rushed him back to the center, where the old surgical table groaned under Keir's weight. Ellie worked through the night, Calla never leaving the operating room. She paced at the door, then curled into a ball against the wall, unmoving. The surgery was long. The infection deeper than they feared. Ellie fought not only bacteria, but the wild instincts still strong in Keir. His muscles twitched, his breath flared with each incision. At dawn, as golden light bled across the floor, Ellie finally stitched the last thread. "I don't know if he'll make it," she murmured to Calla, who stared at her with eyes full of things language couldn't hold. The following days blurred into a rhythm of recovery. Keir refused to eat at first, his eyes distant, his body too weak to fight. But Calla remained with him, curling beside his cot, sometimes licking his ears, other times simply lying still. Ellie caught one moment when Keir rested his massive paw atop Calla's back, not aggressive, not dominant. Gratitude. That night, Ellie sat beside the enclosure and whispered to herself. "You remembered, didn't you? It wasn't just instinct that had driven Keir back to the center. It was home." Then came the poachers. Ellie had noticed the signs for weeks. Unusual boot prints by the outer fence, traps found snapped with no explanation, drone batteries missing from their charging banks. But it wasn't until one night, when Calla didn't come to dinner, that Ellie felt the dread fully settle. She searched the property with 2 rangers, dogs barking in the distance. Near the outer fencing, they found Calla's trail, then her blood. She'd been taken. Ellie's legs buckled. Somewhere behind the trees, behind the borders and legal lines and conservation maps, someone had Calla. Maybe for trade, maybe as bait. And Ellie knew, Keir would feel it. The next morning, Keir's recovery seemed to halt. He didn't move from his corner, didn't react when Ellie opened the gate. She sat down quietly across from him, heartbreaking. "She's gone." The young leopard lifted his head, green eyes hollow. Then, without a sound, he stood and walked to the door. "No, you're not ready," Ellie whispered, rising. "You're still healing. Keir." But he turned, looked at her, and in that glance, there was no question. He was going. For her. The skies over the Midlands had changed. What was once golden morning haze and playful winds had now become dense, humid, and still. Rain had not fallen for days. The forest pulsed with a dry tension, as though the trees were holding their breath. In a thicket just beyond the eastern ridge of Brackenwood Reserve, a patrol team moved cautiously, because something unusual had begun. A series of reports had come in. Scattered livestock carcasses on the edges of farmland, claw marks unlike any the rangers had seen, and strange, low growls captured on distant audio traps. It wasn't a rogue leopard, the signs were different. Faster. More methodical. Smarter. Maya, now 63, stood at the edge of the reserve's control tower, scanning a heat map feed on the screen. The pattern was too calculated for a wild predator. It was as if the creature moved with purpose, bypassing traps, even avoiding human confrontation. But what chilled her most was the shape caught in the latest drone footage, a large feline, with a distinct mark behind its right shoulder. A streak of lighter fur. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the shape on the monitor. Could it be? She whispered. Behind her, Ethan sat at the desk, analyzing sound samples. At 28, Ethan had become the reserve's lead wildlife behaviorist, obsessed with large carnivores, and Maya's closest confidant. He adjusted his headset and froze. Maya, you should hear this, he said. The audio clip was low and gravelly, but unmistakably feline. A deep huff, followed by a single drawn-out exhale. Not a warning. Not aggression. It sounded longing. Familiar. A sound from the past. Elsewhere, in a crumbling chapel swallowed by roots and vines, the leopard moved. Massive now, its frame sleek and coiled with power, but with eyes that flicked in every direction, searching for something. Or someone. His name was unknown to the wild. But to Maya and to that old dog who once nursed him, he was something else. A son. A memory. A miracle. The leopard, Rowan, had grown under the veil of the forest, his instincts sharpened by nature but gentled by a distant warmth he barely remembered. In the wild, he was a ghost. The humans called him the Phantom of Brackenwood. Farmers feared him. Poachers chased shadows. But he wasn't killing. Not truly. He was testing boundaries, probing fences, watching reactions. Almost as if he was trying to understand them. One fog-soaked evening, Maya took a risk. She entered the eastern boundary with nothing but a walking stick, a camera slung around her shoulder, and a basket lined with cloth and meat. Ethan protested. The rangers threatened suspension. But she didn't care. This isn't just some rogue predator, she told them. I know those eyes. I bottle-fed him. I held him when he cried. And if there's even a whisper of truth in what I believe, I have to go. She followed the path lined with dogwood trees, an area Bria once loved. Her steps slowed near the old hollow log, the one where Rowan used to curl beside Bria under the stars. The ground was marked. Large paw prints circled it. A nest of leaves had been carefully arranged inside. She placed the basket gently beside the log. Then she sat down and waited. Night fell. Crickets sang. And then silence. A low rustle. A heavy breath. From the trees, a silhouette moved, slow and deliberate. It didn't pounce. It didn't snarl. It approached in a wide arc, watching her. Rowan stepped into the moonlight. Taller than she remembered. His chest carried old scars. But his eyes, they held something ancient. He sniffed the basket, then looked at her. The moment stretched, taut and fragile as spider silk. Maya didn't speak. She simply tilted her head and reached into her coat, slowly pulling out a weathered blue collar, Bria's. Rowan froze. His muscles tensed, then softened. He stepped forward. Just one paw. Then another. His nose touched the collar. And there, under the hushed canopy of brackenwood, the wild leopard purred. A sound Maya hadn't heard in over a decade. She wept silently, shoulders shaking. For weeks after, Rowan stayed close to the reserve's edge. Rangers spotted him from afar, always near the places Bria once walked. He never attacked. He never lingered too long. It was as if he was remembering something, keeping a vigil. And then, one morning, a wild cry echoed across the hills. A snare trap, deep in the poacher run north. The rangers scrambled, and Ethan led the team. They found the trap sprung, and blood. But not from a leopard. A human poacher lay unconscious, torn across the leg. And there, in the distance, claw marks leading away, not toward the victim. It was clear, Rowan had saved a human. Ethan stared at the trail in disbelief. Why would he? Maya answered with quiet certainty. Because once, a dog did the same for him. The forest was no longer a stranger to Theo. In the 6 years since Ava had found him as a trembling leopard cub beside his dying mother, the cub had become a fully grown male, muscular, confident, and oddly gentle. Locals called him the Ghost of Varnwood, a whisper among loggers and rangers. Few had actually seen him. Fewer still believed he existed. But Grace knew. Every now and then, at the edge of the trees, she caught glimpses of amber eyes watching from the shadows. She never tried to follow him. She didn't need to. She had raised him with hands that smelled of milk and antiseptic, under the flickering light of a desk lamp and the heartbeat of a mother dog who never questioned her instincts. But time has a cruel rhythm, and it was quickening. One October evening, the forest was set ablaze with orange light as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Ava, now slower, lay curled on her bed on the porch, her breathing shallow. Grace sat beside her, brushing the old dog's thinning fur. Every breath Ava took seemed like a thread pulling tighter around Grace's chest. "She's waiting for him," whispered Grace, not knowing if she believed it or just needed to. And then it happened. A single, guttural growl from the trees. Not a threat, more like a call. Grace stood, heart hammering. Her eyes scanned the tree-line. Leaves shifted. A shape moved. A massive form, bigger than she remembered, his spots faded slightly with age, but unmistakably Theo. He stepped into the clearing, sunlight catching in his golden eyes. His body was a masterpiece of wild power, but it was the way he moved, slow, careful, deliberate, that took Grace's breath away. He wasn't hunting. He was home. Grace didn't move. Neither did Ava, though her tail gave a single, weak thump. Theo came closer. Not fast. Like he remembered this path. Like he knew every creak of the boards on the porch. He stopped just short of Ava, lowering his head. Then, in a motion so slow it felt sacred, he pressed his forehead against the old dog's side. Grace covered her mouth. The wind carried a quiet whimper from Ava. Her tail thumped again, twice this time. Theo laid beside her, curling protectively around her fading frame, his massive paw resting gently over her leg like a sibling cradling a newborn. They stayed like that as the stars blinked into existence above the trees. The next morning, Ava was gone. Grace found her with her head still resting against Theo's chest, her face peaceful, her body still. Theo didn't move when Grace knelt down. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw pain, yes, but not wild grief. Something more complex. As if he'd understood this was coming and had returned to repay a debt. Not with violence. Not with revenge. With presence. With love. Grace buried Ava at the edge of the forest, under the same oak where she had once found Theo curled up and bleeding all those years ago. Theo stayed by the grave until the sun fell behind the horizon. Then, without a sound, he slipped back into the woods. But he didn't disappear entirely. A week later, a camera trap captured him sitting at the base of the tree. Not moving. Just sitting. 2 weeks after that, Grace found a half-eaten carcass left on her porch, freshly killed, deliberately placed. She knew it was Theo's doing. A gift. Maybe a goodbye. Maybe a promise he was still out there. News began to spread again. People whispered of the leopard who loved a dog. A viral photo circulated of Theo lying beside Ava's grave. Grace didn't post it, someone else must have captured it, but she didn't mind. It didn't cheapen the moment. It reminded people that animals weren't just survival machines. They were capable of mourning, of remembering, of love. And then came the fire. A lightning strike in late November set the dry undergrowth ablaze. It moved fast, faster than fire crews could respond to. Grace evacuated with the rest of the village, her eyes constantly on the ridge, terrified for Theo. The fire raged for days. Wildlife rescue teams searched but found no signs of him or any large predators. Many believed he had escaped to higher ground. Some believed he didn't make it. But Grace, she waited. 6 months later, spring returned. The forest was regrowing. And one early morning, Just before the mist lifted, Grace stepped outside to check the camera traps. The screen blinked on. And there he was, standing beside a small tree, his coat singed in places but unmistakably him. He wasn't alone. 2 small cubs, leopard cubs, peeked out from behind a tree trunk. And beside them, shockingly, padded a dog, young, wiry, with mottled fur. A stray perhaps, or a wild descendant of Ava's bloodline. But the bond was undeniable. Theo had brought them back. He hadn't just survived. He'd continued the story. In the years that followed, Grace turned the cabin into a wildlife observation center. Not commercial, not flashy. Just a place to teach children and adults alike about wild bonds and unexpected families. Visitors sometimes asked about the story of Ava and Theo. Grace would smile, her eyes misty, and say, "Sometimes love crosses species. Sometimes it saves lives. And if you're lucky, it comes back when you need it most." The world would never know the language of animals, but those who had witnessed Silas's return knew something greater than words. They saw it in the stillness of his eyes when he lingered near Fern's grave, in the gentle way he rubbed his head against Walter's weathered hand, and in the path he took, once wild, once nurtured, now something in between. It wasn't just the story of a dog raising a leopard. It was the story of what happens when love is given without condition, when protection is offered not by instinct, but by choice. Fern had given her heart to something the world said she couldn't keep. And years later that love came back, not in words, not in repayment, but in remembrance. Sometimes, what you raise isn't meant to stay. But if you raise it with love, it always returns, changed, but never forgetting.